directly to the front, eh? You can do the final.
You have to be aggressive. If you're not aggressive, you're not in the race.
Is it a little bit uncomfortable that you've got guys that people say, we don't really like the fact that you've got this ex-doper on your team and so on and so forth? Yes, that's extremely uncomfortable.
I'm very busy, but I always find a little bit of time for our listeners, for you.
With exclusive interviews and the best analysis on two wheels, this is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birney.
Hello again, Richard.
Daniel Freeb.
Hello.
And the three of us are just together here to introduce an extended interview with Chris Baldwin, the press attaché for Team Astana. And Chris gave us a lengthy interview last year, gave us a bit of background about himself, how he came as an American to be working for a Kazakhstan cycling team. It's quite a colourful and interesting story that Chris tells very well. He's an interesting character, and Astana, of course, have had a torrid time of it since Vincenzo Nibali won the Tour de France last year. 5 positive tests for the Astana kind of group. That includes the development team and the WorldTour team. 2 positive tests for EPO and the World Tour team for the Iglinsky brothers, which has cast their future into doubt with their UCI World Tour licence threatened with withdrawal at various points. Future still pretty much in doubt. They're still fighting a rearguard action really, and perhaps beginning also to mount a bit of a PR campaign to restore their public image. And you spoke to Chris Baldwin recently, Lionel. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about?
Well, it came about really just from chatting to him at Paris-Nice one morning and talking about Astana's roller coaster last 6 months, from the high of winning the Tour de France to the low of a couple of positive tests for EPO, and then all of the things that were going on with the Continental team, which is Kazakh based as well, and the perception that they were just riding out a storm. There was also, of course, the allegation in Gazzetta dello Sport, the Italian newspaper, that Michele Ferrari had been working with riders on the team. That's something that Chris firmly denies in the interview. He was adamant about that. And we just talked about whether or not he would be prepared to talk about Astana, because it is his team, as he points out. It's a team that's quite kind of opaque to us, really. It hasn't got the same PR image as some other teams. They don't have a whole lot of English speakers on the team. Really, the go-to guy is Jakob Fuglsang. I suppose now with Lars Bohm on the team, that might change a bit. So there is a bit of mystery about them, and I think they have realised that isn't particularly helpful when it comes to how they are covered and how they are perceived by people.
I mean, Daniel might have something to say as well just before we hear the interview, but what's interesting about it, and you can listen to it and judge for yourself what to make of what Chris says. I think what's interesting is to just hear a voice from within the Astana team, and although he sort of sought to just clarify what his role has been in the past as a kind of contact, as somebody disseminating information in several different languages, he was speaking to us sort of on behalf of the team, as for the first time perhaps an official spokesman. It's just interesting to hear somebody from within that organisation talk about how the last few months have actually affected them, because I think, as you say, Lionel, there has been a perception that there's always been a perception with Alexandre Vinokourov, the man in charge of the team, that whatever doping scandals he's involved in, directly or indirectly, he doesn't really care. That's the perception, accurate or not, that he just carries on regardless. And it's very interesting to hear how these scandals, how the bad press that's also surrounded these scandals has actually affected those within the team.
Yeah, I think we talked in the podcast earlier in the week about the Cirque report and the big problem that Astana have, notwithstanding everything that Chris will say in this interview about detection, membership of the NPCC, Vinokourov's attitude to doping. The problem is that the Cirque report, whatever doubts we may express about it, it makes it pretty clear that doping still exists in the professional peloton, and there are a lot of methods that are not being detected very effectively. And when you add that to the history of the Astana team, you add that to certain personnel in the Astana team, it creates a problem, and it creates a lot of doubts and it creates a lot of question marks that I don't think Chris could necessarily solve, could necessarily quell, and perhaps we will never be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, I think as you go into, I'm reluctant, I think, to call it an interview. It's more a conversation. It's kind of trying to find out a little bit more about things from their perspective. You might dispute some of the things that Chris Baldwin says on behalf of Astana. You know, there were parts where I was sort of raising an eyebrow a little bit, and Chris does use the kind of the caveat that he's only been with the team a few years as you know, to kind of avoid talking about certain things from not just the recent past but the team's history. I mean, you know, as I make the point in the conversation, the Astana team was born out of a doping scandal. It was the Liberty Seguros company that pulled the plug around the time of the Operacion Puerto investigation in 2006, and Astana stepped in, a consortium of Kazakh companies backed by the Kazakh government, to effectively ensure that Alexandre Vinokourov had a team to ride for. So the whole team owes itself to a massive blood doping scandal, and I think that it is very difficult to separate the team's history from that, notwithstanding the fact that Vinokourov tested positive in 2007 for a blood transfusion, came back, won the Olympic title, a victory that certainly, from, as Chris says, from a Kazakh point of view, is a sort of redemptive victory, one that should draw a line under his doping and mean that he is a credible person to go forward. I'm not sure that everybody in the rest of Europe or the rest of the world necessarily sees it that way.
Well, as you point out in the conversation, Lionel, it's nonsense, isn't it? The idea that the victory in the hardest race in the world, when we know that there are certain substances, certain methods that can't be detected, that will bring redemption to a team with a questionable reputation, it's nonsense.
But, on the other hand, guys who've been involved very heavily in doping in the past can change their ways, can actually be committed to anti-doping. Yeah. And we see that with lots of people, from Jonathan Vaughters. You know, who's to say that Jonathan Vaughters' doping was any better or worse than Alexandre Vinokourov's? And that we're perhaps guilty of treating different people differently for exactly the same crime. I mean, the only difference Alexandre Vinokourov is he's from Kazakhstan, from a different culture, and he doesn't talk our language. And I think one of the things they can do, because another thing that the CERC report says is that the culture has changed to the point where clean riders can win big bike races. So I think people, wherever they're from, tend to be influenced by the prevailing culture. If that's the culture now, there's every chance, perhaps, to extend the benefit of the doubt to Vinokourov and Astana, that Vinokourov operates the team in a different way to how he used to prepare himself for bike racing. We should hear from Chris now. What we should say, one of the things they can do, of course, is open their doors, be a little bit more transparent, and in the interview you will hear an invitation extended to the cycling podcast to come and spend some time with Vinokourov. We've delegated that to Daniel, whose French is superb, and he and Vinokourov, I'm sure, will get on like a house on fire. Daniel will be dispatched to somewhere to spend some time with Alexandre Vinokourov and report
Kazakhstan, in the Kazakhstan steppe.
We look forward to hearing about that. That'll be an unmissable future podcast.
Before we hear from Chris Baldwin, here's the week's news roundup. It's been a packed week of racing, with attention split between Belgium, Catalonia, Italy and Corsica. Firstly, in Belgium, Geraint Thomas won the Grand Prix E3 Harelbeke ahead of Zdeněk Stybar. They got away with defending champion Peter Sagan before Thomas attacked with 4 kilometres to go to clinch the biggest one-day victory of his career. Earlier in the race, Fabian Cancellara crashed, and he will now miss the rest of the Spring Classics after X-rays showed he'd fractured 2 vertebrae. As entertaining as the final stages of the E3 Harelbeke were, they were no match for a thrilling edition of Ghent-Wevelgem 2 days later. Rain and strong winds caused chaos all day and made it a race for the true strongman. The final 100 kilometres were gripping. A long solo attack by Lotto Soudal's Jürgen Roelants forced a chase move to go clear behind him. Geraint Thomas was there, of course, as were Nicky Terpstra and Stein Vandenberg of Ethics Quickstep. Later on, Luca Paolini came up, and Sepp van Mark was also in that group. At one point, Thomas appeared to be blown off the road by the strong wind as he went round a corner. Fortunately, he landed on a grass verge and chased back up to the group. After Rowlands was caught, there was a bruising final 20 kilometres or so, with several attacks and counter-attacks. But in the end, it was Luca Paolini, the 38-year-old Italian, who made the decisive move, having judged the final phase of the race perfectly. It was a victory for tactical nous as much as physical strength. Thomas finished third to continue his fine spring and make him one of the favourites for the Tour of Flanders and Paris-Roubaix, particularly in the absence of Cancellara and Tom Boonen. The other big one-day race of the week was the Trofeo Binda, the second round of the Women's World Cup in Italy. Britain's Lizzie Armitstead beat two Rabobank live riders, Pauline Ferrand-Prévot, the world champion, and Anna van der Breggen, to get her defence of the World Cup title off to a great start. Also in Italy, Sky's Ben Swift was pipped by MTN Quebec's Louis Menches on the final day of the Settimana Coppi e Bartoli stage race. Swift had won stage 2, but was unseated on the final day by the South African. Meanwhile, over in northern Spain, Richie Porte added the Tour of Catalonia to Paris-Nice, which he won earlier on in March. Alejandro Valverde won 3 stages and was second overall, with Domenico Pozzovivo, Alberto Contador, Rigoberto Urán and Fabio Aru stacked up behind him. Finally, the 2-day Criterium International on the island of Corsica was like a throwback to last year's Tour de France battle between Jean-Christophe Perrault and Thibaut Pinot. Now, as then, it was Perrault who came out on top, winning the final stage to pit Pinot overall. Off the bike, Oleg Tinkoff suspended Bjarne Riis from his management position with the Tinkoff Saxo Bank team, and then on Sunday confirmed that Riis would leave the team by mutual consent. Now then, let's hear from Astana's Chris Baldwin, who is the subject of this week's long-form conversation. If you want more on the Cobble Classics, then sign up to our Friends of the Podcast scheme by visiting thecyclingpodcast.com. It costs £5 for the whole year, and so far we've produced 2 of our 11 or so specials that we'll be doing this year. The most recent one is a study of the Cobble Classics, the Tour of Flanders and Paris-Roubaix, and it's packed with interviews and anecdotes from Richard, Daniel and I. But here then is Chris Baldwin. In a cafe in the back streets of Nice. First of all, Chris, can you explain, a little bit about the capacity in which you're talking to me today and how things stand for Astana at the moment?
Well, I'm the press attaché or the press officer for Astana Pro Team. So my job largely is to take this big multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual squad and distribute the news from it to a lot of different organizations and companies and websites and journalists around the world in a lot of different languages. If anything, I think the best way to describe my job is something like the coordinator between publications and journalists on one side and the team on the other. I'm not a spokesman for the team. A lot of people in the past have gotten a quote from me or interviewed me and then quoted me as a Astana team spokesman. That's not technically correct. I'm not really the guy who speaks for the team or on behalf of the team. But for this matter, things have changed a little bit in that because we don't have any really effective English speakers among our directors. They're either Russian speakers or Italian speakers. It's important for us to be able to express what's happened to us. And so after a long and thorough conversation with Vinokourov and with the director sportif who's here, Dmitry Fofanov, we've sort of come up with the designation of me as the designated speaker on this matter. I think that's a fair assessment of sort of where I am right now and what I'm doing and I guess my capacity with you today.
So sum up the last 6 months for the Astana team then. It's been turbulent to say the least. You win the Tour de France in July and then as the summer and autumn goes on there are positive tests seemingly left, right and centre. That's the perception from us as observers on the outside. And then the team's entire licence to race is under review.
Yeah. 6 months of positive stress in the first part of last year in the preparations for the Tour de France and then 18 days in the yellow jersey. Every day doing the rounds in the mix zone with Vincenzo and every day making sure that all of the social media is updated and taken care of and every day making sure that the sponsors have clear and accurate information and that the news outlets, and particularly in Kazakhstan, know what's happening, how to do things. Stressful, to be sure, but very, very positive stress. I can't. I guess I can only describe that the day after the Tour de France for me was like coming down from a different atmosphere and not having to get up at 6 a.m. and run for 18 hours. And it took about a week, 2 weeks to sort of completely de-res and unplug myself and get ready for the rest of the season. August, as it turns out, is actually more busy in professional cycling than July. And so we raced a lot in August. And so I was perhaps even technically busier. But the stress was lower because you're still sort of riding on that positive sensation. And then the doping positives started coming in. Valentin, Maxim, and then the 3 under 23s. And they didn't all come at once. They came out in dribs and drabs. And just when you think you've been punched enough and all this horrible news that's unbearable and seemingly unrecoverable, another felling blow comes. And the last one came in November when we were already at our first camp for the 2015 season. And then the month of December, which was where we had the UCI in the process of issuing the Pro Tour licenses for the 18 teams that belong to the organization, withhold the issuance of our license upon further review. Something we knew about, something that had been told to us as early as November 6th in the year. And then the very stressful last 4 or 5 days before the issuance of that license, I think it came on a Wednesday, it came at 9 p.m. in the evening. But we had these news articles that came out in Gazzetta dello Sport in the weekend immediately prior to that. News articles we object to, news articles we find to be false and malicious. And then an enormous torrent of avarice, bile, hatred that came over the internet, social media, people on Twitter, people who are rightfully angry about how the team received a license and how the UCI had seemingly failed in preventing a team from getting its license despite all of these cases. And then the end of December, where we thought the matter was closed, we had our license, we were grateful and we were happy and proud to have this license. We worked very hard. And then to have it drag on even further here into the month of March now, where we've had this recommendation to come down from the UCI to ask the Independent License Commission to prevent us from going forward in the 2015 season.
When you say you object to the coverage, what specifically do you object to? Because as a World Tour team, to have 2 positives for EPO in 2014, you know, there's not a lot to object to when it comes to the coverage of that. That's a fact. Those riders, presumably, I mean, I spoke to Alexandre Vinokourov during the tour and I asked him, you know, what assurances can you give us that Astana is running a clean program? And his answer was, you know, short, because obviously I'm asking him in English. You know, the very thing you're talking about there is one of the big problems that we have as a media, a multilingual team, you know, and an English-speaking press. Certainly for a podcast where our listeners are obviously all listening in English. But I asked Vinokourov, you know, what assurances can you give us? And he said, our doctors tell us that there's nobody on this team that can dope. Now, of course, a matter of weeks later, it turns out that somebody had done for EPO, you know, not just, you know, there are degrees of substances, aren't they? But pretty much the bad boy substance. So how do you feel you can object to what the coverage was to that matter?
A lot of it was copy-paste coverage. It's one thing to do original reporting and to be, a professional journalist to go and seek out a story. It's another thing for a lot of the smaller websites to copy and paste and then add layers and layers of unprofessional opinion and commentary on top of it, which people are entitled to do. There's no reason why folks can't have an opinion. But the problem is that it gets lost in an echo chamber and it begins to amplify. And then given the history with Vinokourov in the past, and then what I would call the caricaturization of Vinokourov. If you ask most people what do they think of Alexandre Vinokourov, they'll say he's like a Bond villain. Well, that's all well and good, but my rejoinder is, do you mean fictional? Alexandre Vinokourov is a human being, and he has 3 children, and he lives a normal life, and he takes his pants off to go to the toilet just like the rest of us. But that's that's besides the point. The objectionable part, in particular, with Gazzetta dello Sport, was what we consider to be false and malicious slander in their articles published in the 4 days before we got our UCI license in December. That said, the fact of the matter is we had 2 EPO positives on the big team, 2 brothers who conspired together, who were idiots, who were immediately fired from the team. When Vino spoke to you at the Tour de France and said, the doctors tell us this is true, what got lost, obviously, in the translation is the scope of our internal testing programs and the scope of our commitments to anti-doping. Vinokourov recognizes his history in the sport, and he wants to change it and make it better for the future. But because of this cultural gap between who he is and how he behaves in his life and who the rest of the world is and how they perceive him, there's this disconnect. And I think we talked about this when I spoke to you at the Giro last year. Vino's suspension was his punishment. His redemption was his Olympic medal in the eyes of the Kazakh Cycling Federation. And in the eyes of the Kazakh Cycling Federation, that's enough. That's really important. In fact, that's fantastic. Unfortunately, in the eyes of the world, and in particular in certain demographic markets around the world, that's not enough. Because there have been ex-dopers before who've come out and given grand mea culpas and who've given grand testimony and who have gone so far as to write books and go on lecture tours about their own doping practices. That sets the bar rather high, but it also sets the bar sort of in a different part of the world. And because of that conflict between those cultures, the emotion and the sentiment that gets aroused by that sometimes doesn't correspond to what's actually happening in reality.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast and British Eurosport, the home of cycling.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. My name is Lionel Burney, and in this episode of the show, we're talking to Chris Baldwin, the press attaché for the Astana team. So the difficulty is to comprehend an ex-doper, somebody who doped from from the perspective. I mean, I remember the 2007 Tour de France when he'd crashed early in the race. Both his knees were heavily bandaged. He could barely walk from the team car to the hotel. I remember watching him hobble across a car park in Pau. And yet he won 2 stages, a time trial, a very hard time trial in Albi, and a mountain stage in the Pyrenees. And then he was tested positive for the blood transfusion. And then there wasn't an awful lot of regret expressed at that time. It was a kind of there was sort of lines that were coming out about this couldn't possibly be true. If this is my father's blood, then it would test positive for vodka and all of this. So there wasn't you're right what you say, the sort of cultural thing, but the other thing is that the Astana team was born out of a doping scandal. It exists initially primarily because the Liberty Seguros company in Spain pulled out after the Operacion Puerto investigation and raids and what have you in 2006. The Wurth, which is a German company, finance company, I think, but I have to check that. They stepped in as a kind of intermediary sponsor. They stepped up from secondary sponsor to title sponsor for a while, and then this consortium of Kazakh companies under the Astana brand basically carried the team forward purely for Vinokourov. So the team actually was born out of a doping scandal, and all of that history can't be separated. Is one of the problems. But as press attaché, this might be an unfair question. I don't know how close you are to the running of the team, but what kind of assurances can you give us that there isn't some kind of a subterranean doping program going on? Because again, we're here in Nice. Kazakhstan is a long way away. There's all these other sort of, as you quite rightly say, there's this suspicion that there's an opaqueness about the team, which is difficult to see past, I think, for a lot of people.
Compared to Sky and their particular approach to how they handle doping and anti-doping, Astana is a different team, very much a different team. The history of the team I can't really speak to. You know much more about cycling than I do. I came to this business 5 years ago. 2007, I was a graduate trainee in the Reuters news program, and more interested in stock market reports and things like that. We have an internal testing program with our own doctors. We have 4 doctors who work with all of the riders, who have weekly, if not bi-weekly, consultations with the riders. We do extensive pre-testing and biopassport examinations of all the riders who come in to make sure that they're clean when they come in and that they don't have a history that would prevent them from joining the team. Vinokourov has instilled all of these programs. One of the first things we did, one of the very first things I remember doing coming into this team in my job as a press attaché, was writing the press release for our membership application to join the MPCC. The MPCC is this extra layer of anti-doping. So now I think that gives us like 4 or 5 different organizations that test us throughout the year. And the MPCC is this really comprehensive, almost overprotective organization based on the French model for professional cycling to prevent the abuse of cortisones, to keep people out of races, because there are folks who use cortisones improperly, and not just for health reasons, to recover from injuries or from crashes, things like that. Because we believe very strongly, and that the most important thing to do is to join these organizations and stay within the structure of cycling, because the whole sport is new now, and it's not the same sport that it was in 2007. And that's largely born out of the doping scandals. I mean, you're right to say that, you know, the doping scandals of the Liberty Seguros team gave birth to this. But for Kazakhstan, you have to understand that this culture, up until 2007, their one claim to fame was Sacha Baron Cohen in a funny suit, in a bathing suit and knee-high socks.
This is Borat. You're talking about the comedy character.
And so this country, by no fault of its own, was sort of cast as the joke of the world. And it's an enormous country. It's larger than continental Europe. It only has 15 million people. Hugely multi-ethnic, the second largest Armenian population in the world. Largest Chechen population until most of them repatriated in the fall of the Soviet Union. Lots of money to rebuild their capital. It's a pretty remarkable place. And I think they sort of looked around and they said, "Oh no, how are we going to recover from this, skinny tall jokester who just made fun of us?" And they saw this opportunity with cycling, and they saw that they had this unnaturally strong talent in professional cycling who was achieving all of these great things in the pro peloton from 1998 forward. And because the prime minister at the time himself had been a cyclist as a junior, there were connections, and they said, "Hey, we have this license, we have this opportunity to buy this license and take this team, let's go forward." This wasn't done as a commercial decision in order to sell subscriptions to a cable news service or to sell vacuum cleaners. Or I think Worth is a tool manufacturer, so to sell tools, you may be right that it's a financial thing. This was to sell the country, sell Kazakhstan, and to begin to promote the image of Kazakhstan. And to show to people, hey, we're more than just this guy in a green bathing suit talking about his sister, the prostitute. Over the years, there have been peaks and valleys. I think the general management of Astana has changed 5 or 6 times since they took the license in 2007. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. When Vino won the Olympics, he solidified his bona fides with the Kazakhstan Cycling Federation and said, when I retire, I want to be the general manager of this project and I want to take this forward. And by hook or by crook, with a combination of skills and a combination of people, Vino has set out to reestablish this team as a leader in the new cycling that's going on now. Unfortunately, we don't have a television studio that can help promote our message every day of the week. And we don't have those resources to do that. We also don't really have the public behind us. You know, the ethnic Kazakhs and the ethnic Russians and the ethnic folks who live in Kazakhstan, their most favorite sport is boxing. And they have a world champion boxer right now, Gennady Golovkin, who's winning titles right and left. He's a fantastic boxer, who's much more popular at home than the Astana Pro team is. But the fact of the matter is that boxing is much easier to understand across a lot of multi-ethnic, multilingual lines than bike racing is. It's complicated, and it's hard to do this.
I think I've just counted maybe 3 oblique references to Sky here, and the James Bond analogy. You know, clearly you see Sky as James Bond and Vinokourov, or you think some people see Sky as James Bond and Vinokourov as the Bond villain in his Kazakh lair. I won't make a joke and ask whether Vino's got a white cat or anything like that. But seriously, this is clearly a problem for you because the perception. You're right. That is the perception. So the difficulty is that you've had these positive tests, and from the outside, with riders testing positive from the development squad as well, I guess that is what the independent report, looking at the difference, the disparity perhaps between the policies as stated and the realities. I mean, what can you explain about that particular line, and do you believe that to be the case? Is there a kind of a shop front that where you say all this stuff and actually out the back something else is going on?
I haven't seen the report. I don't know. I've talked to people who have seen the report. I saw that line too, and that was the line that was in the press release. The big differences between word and deed. Perhaps it's because our word isn't. Because, I mean, it may be. I don't know. It may be to the opposite effect, that we're actually doing more than we even talk about. Who knows? I don't know if they would object on those grounds alone. What I can say though is that we have our internal testing structure, which we follow very closely. We have the MPCC, which tests us. We have all of the federations that test us. We have the race organizers who test us. There are idiots in this world, and the Iglinsky brothers were idiots.
Did you know them very well at all? Did what were they like as guys when they were on the team?
Maxim's a sweetheart. I really like Maxim. He's a really nice guy. Valentin has a profound stutter, and I think it somehow in some way affected his personality as a child. You may have to believe this, but he's an asshole. Valentin is an asshole personally, and I'm not ashamed to say that. The juniors we never saw. It's a completely different structure. We didn't race with them. We hired the one guy, David Jonak, as a stagiaire, and he raced one race with us in Burgos last year, and then we let him go. And then he went to back to the national team, the U23 team, and he tested positive at the Tour de l'Avenir. Nobody's seen him since then, since his positives. He disappeared. He won the race in China, Tour of Qinghai Lake. He took cash home. The organizers give cash at the end of that race. He disappeared with his cash. He's gone.
You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast, brought to you by Van Dessel Cycles. Van Dessel, ride inspired.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. My name's Lionel Burney, and in this episode of the show, we're talking to Chris Baldwin, the press attaché for the Astana team. I guess this is one of the, again, talking cultural differences, and I'm trying not to draw a parallel between what's going on in Russian athletics, but there's such a huge pool of people in Russian athletics, sorry to divert here, but the carrot at the end, the fame, the wealth, the medals, whatever, and there's this big pool that could potentially get there, and when somebody tests positive, they're gone, and then somebody else comes into the place, in to replace them. That seems to me, I'm not an athletics reporter, but that seems to be how things are going in that sport. So is the biggest challenge for the Astana World Tour team and for Vinokourov to say, yeah, that's what I did, and it got me this Olympic, it got me the Tour de France stage wins and what have you. Then I had to serve a 2-year ban. Then I came back and I won the Olympic medal. If you're a 21-year-old kid and you see that that's the possibility at the end, the incentives to take those risks are there. So your message presumably has to be even stronger, that actually this path is not the right one to take. So is there work going on between the senior team and the development team?
Well, no, but here's what we've done, though. Kazakhstan has signed a memorandum of understanding with the World Anti-Doping Association, and we're going to install, I say we in the royal sense, but Kazakhstan is instilling a biopassport system for its amateur athletics and then is going to put all of its, I think, 5,000 targeted athletes, or as many as 5,000 athletes, on this internal biopassport program. Conduct seminars especially with the young trainers, to make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, Kazakhstan is a big country. It's agrarian. I would say that its economy is strong. It's not Africa poor, but it's not as rich as a first world country in Europe. And as I said before, there are idiots everywhere who will take risks for their own personal gain, and disregard the hard work that's gone on before them to build a team like this. We're a clean team. We're a transparent team, as transparent as we can be. We invite people to come in and see us. I mean, one of the things that we talked about with Vinokourov last night in talking about doing this interview today is that it's important that we establish a beachhead, particularly in English, and say, this is where we are. We invite you to come back and use all of those people out there who will listen to this, particularly among the journalists, use your language skills to come in and interview the staff in languages where they're more proficient, in Italian and in French and in Russian, and follow up on these questions.
Well, Daniel, one of my colleagues on the podcast, he's got lots of languages. He would be able to do that. So, we can fix that up for later on in the spring, or perhaps at one of the races later in the year. In terms of how this has affected, first of all, Vincenzo Nibali as the defending Tour champion, was there ever a moment where the team feared that you may lose him somehow?
No, I'd say the fear that happened to us was in the Monday before we received word of our UCI license in December. We were all together in Calpe and in the hotel there doing our first December training session. And there was this moment, especially after the Gazzetta story came out, and it's this false Gazzetta story that said that there were photographs of Ferrari outside the building in Montecatini. It's a false story.
So there are no photographs?
There are no photographs. It's a false story. But that story planted a seed of doubt in all of our heads. And the metaphor is, you're in a bunker and they're shelling you with artillery, not because they can get through the bunker, but because they want you to run out and let the snipers pick you off. That was a scary moment for us, that Monday and that Tuesday. When we held it together, we kept it together. We found a translation of Rudyard Kipling's If in about 6 different languages, and we took turns reading it at the dinner table. Whatever works. And we got through it. And that was the scary part, because everybody just sort of thought, what if he had been there? What if Ferrari had been there? Did you see him? Did you see him? What happened? And it was this seed of doubt that had been planted in our heads quite successfully by this news article. In the long run, no. Vincenzo Nibali is super cool. He's cooler than all of us put together. He held his mud. And in doing so, the rest of the team held their mud. And we got through, and we got to that Wednesday evening at 9 o'clock at night, and we got word that we got our license. And that was a big sigh of relief for us, because it meant that the artillery was going to stop, or at least not draw us out. Yeah.
So can you say categorically that Michele Ferrari has not worked with Vinokourov or with Astana athletes?
Well, you're asking me to go into things that I don't know about. So before I came to this team, which was 3 years ago, I worked with Team Type 1 in the United States, and I was primarily an enthusiast for a pro-continental team, and I had a very large mental database about diabetes and the effects of exercise in mediating that disease. I don't know a lot about training. I was never a professional cyclist myself. I know the rumors about it. I've never had conversations with my management about their previous training.
But currently, I mean, since Michele Ferrari has been banned from working within cycling.
Currently, no. I mean, I think all you have to do is go to Michele Ferrari's own article published in the wake of the Gazzetta article, where he said the only time he'd been in Montecatini was to taste the waffles.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily say he hasn't worked with... What my question is, has Michele Ferrari worked with Astana athletes in the last, 18 months?
No.
So in terms of Vincenzo Nibali, there was no stress that he would seek to go to another team where perhaps there's not so much heat on. But in terms of I don't want to say more lowly paid riders, but that's the reality. People for whom they wouldn't immediately be able to get another job at another big team, and all of the staff and the mechanics and the soigneurs. What was the atmosphere like on that training camp? And is there still a sort of sense of disquiet, uncertainty?
No, I'd say there's more solidarity now. But like I said, on that Monday, after that Gazeta article came out, because that article came out and everybody read it, and everybody had a private moment of panic. People who were expecting a baby, people who had just put a down payment on an apartment, people who were getting ready to start their first season, and for that matter, the 10 new riders we had hired along. Terrific, wonderful champions of the sport who didn't deserve to be dragged through that kind of mud, and who, in their own home countries, were subjected to all of the vicissitudes that come out of the press in places like the Netherlands, places like Denmark, places like Colombia, who began to question, where will our prized rider go? People who were, reporters who were making that leap of logic. Oh, well, the team's already in the toilet and flushed, and what's going to happen to our guy? That was that seed of doubt. That's since gone away. We've had the reassurances. We've met with our lawyers. We've gone through this process. We had a long consultation with the Institute of Science and Sport in Lausanne to go through this review. We feel very strongly that we've done the best we can to show what kind of team we are, that we're a clean team, that we're a transparent team, that we want people to come in and see us, and that we are among the vanguard in leading the fight in anti-doping. With testing, with monitoring of riders, with our own internal monitoring. Where we don't lead the vanguard is advertisement and public relations. Partly, that's because I'm not a public relations guy and I don't have an advertising budget, but also partly because that's not the style of this team. Our stated purpose this year is to go back and win the Tour de France again. We feel that the best way to prove that we are a clean team is to go back and do it. But also, we've added all of these terrific riders to come in and win all of these other races in the meantime. So Guardini had a fantastic winter, a really healthy winter. And he's gone on and he's now won, I think he won his fourth stage today in Langkawi. So he's won 5 races this year. Rain Taramaya won in Vuelta a Murcia, surprised himself, surprised all of us.
That's great, and but coming perhaps because of where I've come from in the sport, covering the narrative that somebody wins another race to prove their critics wrong, and this proves winning races doesn't prove cleanliness. That's a big problem for not just Astana, not just Sky, but for every team. Sky had a 1-2 here in Paris-Nice, and social media's lit up with suggestions that there's something going on there. That is the culture we now have, partly as a result of all of the doping scandals through the 90s and the 2000s, the fall of Lance Armstrong, and particularly this week, the publication of the Cycling Independent Reform Commission report, which I meant to ask a bit earlier. Have you guys read it? I didn't notice any Astana people in the actual list of people who had spoken to them, but there's some people spoke anonymously. Do you know if anyone from the team's organisation, riders, staff, did they volunteer some information to them? You don't happen to know, or?
I don't know. I know Vino spoke because of what I've read. I haven't talked to him about it. But you're right. The perception of cycling, particularly among the converted, is that nothing is true and everything is false and everybody is fighting for themselves. That's not the case. We have to be realists about this, and we have to say, okay, cycling has changed. All of these instruments are in place. Cheaters are being caught. Idiots exist, and idiots continue to exist around the world in all different aspects of life, not just sport. There are very strong mechanisms in place now to catch these people out in professional cycling, and we're doing everything we can to take part in as many of those programs as possible to prove that that's the case. The fact of the matter is that once you're naked, you can't get more naked. And we're all sort of naked in this sport. And there are more recommendations coming in that they wanted to get us more naked and they want to go inside. And particularly, the The one thing about the Cirque report that I find a bit of lunacy is to increase testing between 11 at night and 6 in the morning, as if that were somehow the final missing link. Like I said, I only have 4 years of experience in this sport. But with all the other testing that's going on in the world, I mean, our guy Fabio Aru took a vacation in Miami over the winter and was tested in Miami. They came to his vacation hotel because he was on the whereabouts program. They took his blood in the morning. Great. I mean, it's a bit of a bummer to have your vacation interrupted, but hey, the system is in place. The system is effective. There are smart, efficient, comprehensive people within the anti-doping organizations around the world who are following these programs. That's great because it's catching people. It's not for me to decide, but that's how I feel about it.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Join us on Twitter and Facebook. Just search online for the Cycling Podcast.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. My name's Lionel Burney, and in this episode of the show, we're talking to Chris Baldwin, the press attaché for the Astana team. What was the atmosphere in the bus first couple of days after the report came out, and the headline was 90% of current professionals in the peloton are doping?
Yeah, well, that's the fault of journalists. The fault of journalists who seized on that moment.
But it's the top line in the report, Chris. I mean, what would, if you're a journalist and you read that report in your office, wherever you are, that leaps out. Yeah. That absolutely leaps out.
And that's because the fact that some anonymous guy said he thinks probably 90% of the peloton is still doping, and they don't say who he is, and they don't say in what context, is this guy an ex-champion, or is he a bitter guy who didn't get a contract? Who is he? You have to parse that. You have to unpack that and go into it. You're right. It's not entirely the journalist's fault.
From a journalist's perspective, if somebody told me I think 90% of the peloton are doping, unless I could attribute that to that person, it's worthless as a quote. But once it's appeared in a report that's been commissioned and sanctioned by the UCI, then that's when it becomes a story.
Well, yeah, the Cirque report. A lot of people have issues with the Cirque report. A lot of people who are much smarter than I am can speak more eloquently and more intelligently about this report. The one thing I can say is the Cirque report came out, and it was sent as an embargoed preview to a couple of news organizations who were ready to publish it under embargo at, I think, 2 o'clock in the morning, Central European time. But there was no press conference for it. And there was no grand authority who stood up on a podium and said, "You, the invited members of the press, I am here to tell you that this is the results of our comprehensive, groundbreaking, day zero investigation into the doping practices previously in the sport. And this is where we believe the sport is going, and these are the recommendations we have."
I think some journalists were invited to Switzerland the day after the report came out. I'm not sure, and certainly we've had an invitation to talk to Brian Cookson in London next week. So, but yeah, I take your point.
Yeah, and so, I mean, you draw your own conclusions at that point. Like I said, I've only been in this sport 4 years, and I'm not really a qualified expert to talk about the comprehensive history of what goes on. But what I can say is, among the guys, among the riders, there was very little discussion of the Cirque report. First of all, because it's 228 pages in English, and we have a couple fluent English speakers in the team, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're fluent English readers. And, when a guy's training to come into this race, his first priority is not to sit down with a PDF and scroll through it. What I did at first was I did a lot of keyword searches. It was one of the miracles of computers. You're right. There's no mentions of Astana riders. There's not a lot of mentions of the Astana team. There were a couple of anonymous quotes in there talking about interference from the Kazakhstan government. What I can say is that nobody from the Kazakhstan government has ever called me to change anything. I think that was probably somebody under previous management and previous problems. I mean, if you go back in history and you'll see what I'm talking about. For these guys here, and for the guys who are in Langkawi this week, racing there, and for the guys who are down in Tirreno Adriatico, they largely relied on what was written in the press about it. So the guys who are Italian read what Gazzetta dello Sport had to say, and the guys who are Dutch read what Handelsblad had to say, and the guys who are Slovenian read what the Slovenian newspapers had to say, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think anybody's ever, among our team, is going to sit down and read all 228 pages in there. I think most of them see it as a bureaucratic step, for better or for worse, that was taken by the authorities in the sport to assess what happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
My last kind of two questions. Firstly, what sort of year are you braced for? You talked about positive stress, negative stress. The spotlight is always on cycling at the Tour de France time. You're going to go into the race with the defending champion. What are you anticipating?
I would really like to see Lars Boom win Tour of Flanders and then Paris-Roubaix, one of those two races. Tour of Flanders, personally, if Lars Boom wins Tour of Flanders, I will take off all of my clothes and jump in the river at the finish. And you can quote me on that, because that will be, for me, that would be the pinnacle of the sport. I think that's the greatest thing. But in terms of work and stress, I expect a lot more questions like this. I expect a lot more encounters like this, but I expect them to be spread out and to become diffuse. And what I generally hope, is that step by step, brick by brick, word by word, we can relay to the world what it is that we know internally about our team. That's going to take some cultural shift on the part of our directors, and it's also going to take, I think, a large part, a cultural shift on the part of readers out there who want to hear what we have to say. Because no matter what, I mean, I can say 1,000 times, Vino could say 1,000 times, we can all say 1,000 times that we're a clean team and that we're a transparent team and that there's no organized doping going on in Astana Pro Team. But there's always some guy out there with an anonymous Twitter handle and 40 followers who's just going to spread bile. And unfortunately, that's going to influence from somebody to say something. I've had reporters call me and say, "Oh, Chris, there are rumors on Twitter that such and such has happened." And I'll say, "Well, who was it? Was it Brian Cookson spreading that rumor?" "Oh, no, it was, at hankypanky.com. Well, come on. But because it's out there, somehow it achieves some sort of physical weight and therefore truth, and these reporters feel compelled to drive it on. That's one of the changes I feel. The other change is that we want to put Fabio in the Giro. We want to see him race a great Giro, and then we want to go back to the Tour. And we want to make that start in the Netherlands, in Utrecht. We want Lars to win the prologue, and then we want to see Vincenzo and the rest of the guys rocket on the cobbles. And then we want to see our competitors stay in this year and race into the third week. And we want to have that big duel in the third week. And then we want to be in the first car on the Champs-Élysées on the last day.
Just to pick up on that point you make about the anonymous people on Twitter, obviously Twitter didn't really exist. It was just coming in to become a relevant thing, 2006, 2007 perhaps. But all of that reaction is a direct consequence of, I'm not putting it all on Vinokourov, but on the actions of that generation of guys, and the mistrust and the suspicion and the refusal, like you said there, we're a clean team, you could say that 1,000 times, carries so little weight. That's the problem that you have. So to turn it around a little bit, you've talked very eloquently for 35, 40 minutes here. Your position, you're the kind of the front man, if you like, to the English language here. So presumably you're aware that if there is something going on behind, you're like the corporate shill for protecting Astana and some Kazakh companies and I don't want to be flippant, but the glorious name of Kazakhstan. You're there kind of defending it, standing up for it, saying how it is from your perspective. Presumably, I mean, your reputation and your entire kind of self, you're either a great sort of corporate frontman, or you don't know what you're doing and you don't know, or you do know and you're just trying to portray the best possible message you can.
Yeah. Or maybe I'm telling the truth. And my sphincter is quite relaxed right now. And I feel like I'm telling the truth. There are, Donald Rumsfeld said that there are things you know about and things you don't know about, and then things you don't know that you don't know about. Then the unknown knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. I don't know. The Errol Morris film's fantastic if you haven't watched it, the documentary. But that philosophy rings true, despite what you may think of Donald Rumsfeld. There are things I know about, and I can talk about those things. There are things I don't know about, I can go find out about. There are things I don't even know exist, and I can't ask about. But that can be said about the whole world. One of the things I do know, and I've been working with Russians for about 25 years. I have a lot of experience working with Russians. Russians are different. than you and me. I lived in London for 3 years, and I know the English culture. And I can say that the English are different from me, the American. I'm from Montana, and I grew up in Fresno, California. People from Fresno, California are different than people from Montana. People are different all around the world. And one person's going to believe you one way, and one person's going to behave a different way. And the best we can do is just be true to ourselves. And the best we can do is just tell the truth all the time. I mean, if that's a philosophy to live by, that's great. If I can defend myself with that, that's what I got to do.
Well, we'd certainly like to take up the invitation to come and work more closely with the Astana team as the race season goes on.
Come by. Yeah, we're welcome to. I mean, come to the Classics and come to our hotel in the Classics and come see us. You can come to our Paris-Roubaix recon ride, but you might need to bring a motorcycle. I would say if you can hire a motorcycle, you can come along.
I've ridden those roads, so I know exactly what you're talking about. We will take you up on that during the Classic. We'll see you in Belgium and France. Well, that concludes our interview with Chris Baldwin. Whether you agreed or disagreed with what Chris said, it certainly shed a bit more light on how the Astana team operates and how it feels it's being perceived by the rest of the cycling world. Well, that's all for this show. We'll have a regular episode of the Cycling Podcast next Thursday. You can find all our episodes on thecyclingpodcast.com, download them on iTunes, various other podcast apps. A big thank you to our sponsors, British Eurosport and Van Dessel Cycles, and a thank you to our editor on this episode, John Mooney. My name's Lionel Burney. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pear for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.